Hey, welcome to the Friday show brought to you by Woodbine. And there is a huge day of racing on Sunday at Woodbine, the Canadian International. It's the 84th running and the 50th anniversary of Secretariat's win in the race. They've got the Secretariat 50th anniversary display at Woodbine right now. The three grade stakes, the Canadian International, the E.P. Taylor, and the Arctic. Also, Sunday is Thoroughbred Aftercare Day, honoring Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance and Long Run Thoroughbreds, an important aftercare organization there. Speaking of aftercare, happy to be joined not only by Natalie Voss, editor-in-chief of the Paulick Report, but by Lucinda Lovitt, executive director of CARMA, California Retirement Management Account, which funds aftercare organizations in California. Lucinda, you were mentioned in a story, quoted in the story that Natalie wrote earlier this week, and we thought it'd be great to have you on to talk about some of these topics. Welcome to the Friday show.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Glad to be here.
So for people who don't really know what CARMA is, can you give us the real quick version of who they are and what they do?
Sure. 30-second soundbite. We are a funding charity established in 2008 here in California that raises money and awareness for retired racehorses, specifically those horses that have raced in California. We award grants annually. We serve horsemen with a placement program to help them transition their horses off the racetrack. We host awareness events and a annual thoroughbred horse show here in California, Southern California. That's the short version. There's more.
So the story that we ran this week, where I talked to you, Lisa, as well as somebody, a trainer out in Arizona, was sort of focused around the potential impending closure of Golden Gate Fields and Turf Paradise. One of the things that you suggested these events could really start off for people is a good reminder to think about retirement planning for their horses. So how do you sort of encourage owners to approach that?
Right. Well, I mean, my background before I was the executive director of CARMA was working for the Thoroughbred Owners of California, which is a membership organization here representing all of the licensed owners. And a big part of my job when I was there was hosting and running their continuing education for owners. And we spent a lot of time talking about owners having business plans, financial planning, ways to get into the business of owning racehorses and how to maintain a successful presence, how to have a successful stable, not in terms of winners and success, at the racetrack necessarily, while that's always the goal, but how to run your business like a business. And over the last 15 years, really, aftercare has become a more important part of the racing conversation. The general public has taken a good look at our industry. And one thing that they expect is that these horses have something to do when their racing careers are over. And while I believe that it has always happened to a certain degree, definitely over the last 15 years, we've seen a kind of a formalization of that retirement process. And I think it is important for owners to remember that now, especially, that retirement plan needs to be a part of that business plan at the beginning. And one way we do that is by saying it. Our motto this year is aftercare is not an afterthought. 2 years ago, we launched a campaign called Own, Race, Retire. And that's just a way of putting it kind of at the forefront of the conversation that it's the owner's responsibility, the trainer's responsibility, their business managers, farm managers, whoever is in that advisory circle needs to be talking about aftercare at the same time they're talking about going to the yearling sale. So it has to be a part of the conversation at the beginning. Racing is expensive. Aftercare is expensive. horses live for a long time. This is something we talk about a lot. People ask us all kinds of questions about, well, what does it really cost to retire a racehorse? I'm like, well, that horse is going to live to 25 to 30 years old. So if you're retiring them at 5, we're talking about 20 to 25 years of care. Somebody's going to be feeding him or her.
And that brings up a question I have. There's different kinds of retirement for horses. There's standing in the field with a bunch of friends retirement. There's competing in competitions, dressage, all sorts of second careers for horses. One of the things that prevents the second thing from happening is a term that I learned a few years ago called one last race syndrome, where trainers or owners just want to get one more race out of a horse, and that ends up being the race that prevents this horse from being really useful in other endeavors. Are owners understanding what that means now, trainers and owners?
I think so. I do. I really do think so. That was an interesting phrase that I think it was first introduced at a Jockey Club roundtable, I believe. And it was in relation to injuries and permanently retiring injuries, right? So I always equate when my friends outside of racing ask me about why I have to retire racehorses and what happens to them. My comment is always, well, racehorses are elite athletes. Think of them as the Olympic athletes of their sport. They get Olympic athletes. Professional athletes have injuries. They have limitations. They spend a lot of time in rehab and doing therapies to try and maintain that kind of elite physical performance all the time. And racehorses are the same way. I think that owners, and I don't want to just say owners because it isn't just owners, right? Again, it's that team that I talked about. It's owners, it's trainers, it's advisors, it's stable managers, it's farm managers, veterinarians, right? Everybody is working together for these horses. I do think that team is becoming more aware. But on the other side of that, the reality is that for many participants in racing, this is a commercial business, as it should be. This is an agricultural commercial business. For the farm owners and the breeders that are selling commercially every year, for the owners that are, trying to have a profitable racing stable. And so there's a balance to making these decisions on whether that horse is a good fit for their stable, depending on the individual animal, but also the whole business the business as a whole, right? All of the other horses in their stable and what's going on. So I think, yes, but probably not the way, animal lovers or pet owners would want. But that's okay because, again, we're in a commercial business. So it's a little bit different, I think.
One of the things that we had talked about, Lucinda, when I'd interviewed you for the story was a little bit of a changing philosophy in how aftercare organizations handle requests for horses. And what I was sort of taking from what you were saying is that there was a time that if somebody called and said, I need the stall empty tomorrow, you got to take the horse, that person's kind of emergency became the aftercare organization's emergency. It sounds like that may not be something that organizations are kind of willing to drop everything and take more horses or more financial burdens than what they can really actually handle. Can you talk a little bit about why that has changed somewhat?
Yeah, and I think that was a really good conversation that we had because it really brings in a lot of different components of aftercare. So we have this, as I said, over the last 15 years, kind of this increased presence of aftercare becoming more forward in the conversation of racing. So it's no longer the thing that we talk about kind of in hushed circles or shadows behind closed doors about where these horses go when they're not racing on the track anymore. And with that there's been kind of an upswell in organizations, right? You see more organizations starting, you see more organizations wanting to participate in this. I think that the kind of the grassroots efforts to have thoroughbreds be more attractive in show rings and more popular again, pays off with more organizations and more people wanting to kind of do that kind of work. And with that kind of comes the same, I think, as I talked about owners needing to run their business like a business, charities are a business. I get that they're not for profit, but that doesn't mean that they should be broke. And that doesn't mean that they should have a negative balance in their checking account every month and that they can't pay their employees, that everybody is working for free because they're taking care of these horses. So in particular, I think I mentioned, Natalie, that with the creation of the Thoroughbred Aftercare Alliance and their accreditation process, that has really elevated the expectations for charities on how they run their business, not just their horse care, while that is also a big part of what accreditation with TAA does, but the expectation that they are running their business like a business. They have solid financials, they have a business plan, they have a succession plan, they have operating procedures that are sound, are based in sound business practice. That means now, as we're 10 years into TAA and 15 years into CARMA, that our expectations as granting and funding organizations are that you're doing a good job in your business, not just taking care of the horses. That's kind of a given. We expect that without question, but that you're also operating in a sound fiscal way. These organizations know that. Their accreditation with TAA is based on those principles. And I think that as the conversation continues to happen with owners, with trainers, with that entire racing community, we're moving away from this, as you said, Natalie, their emergency becomes our emergency. I think that that's a really important thing. It's important so that these charities can continue to operate. We've seen charities close because of a lack of funding, and that is devastating to the aftercare community. We need every single one of these organizations to continue to help us funnel these horses from their racing careers into second careers or permanent retirement or right, whatever that is. The idea is always to get them from being supported by the racing industry to being supported by private equestrians, right? So that we're no longer funding them. Obviously, we're going to have permanent retirement places that will need our continued financial support, but ideally, we want to get horses into people's homes, right? Into show barns, therapy stables, mounted police, guide work, whatever it is that we're talking about, that we want to get them out into kind of the general public. And I think that in order to do that, we need sound organizations. And these organizations know that if they continue to bail out individuals, they're not going to be able to stay open.
So CARMA was started with a very unique funding structure, which was for owners to pay per start, and it was an opt-out, not an opt-in program.
Yeah. And
I assume it's still the same today.
It is the same today. Yeah.
What has the percentage? The number of starts is obviously down since you were started. Is the percentage of owners? Is it pretty much across the board, or where are you on that?
Yeah. So you're right. We have a kind of a unique funding mechanism here in California. It is an opt-out program. So you have to walk into the paymaster's office and say you don't want to participate. And it's 0.3% of purses earned first through fifth for owners. Thanks to the leadership of the late Howard Zucker, we also have 0.3% for trainers and jockeys, first through third place. So we have amazing participation here in California. That trainer and jockey contribution that came about in, I want to say 2018, but 2017, 2018, right around there. I don't remember the exact year, forgive me. Really has made a difference now as we've seen a contraction in racing days. So while we watched our racing weeks go from 5 days to 4 days to 3 days at Santa Anita, we were able to see, well, we did see a contraction and a reduction in revenue, obviously. Mm-hmm. It wasn't quite as big, or it wasn't in exact proportion to the reduction in racing days, because we had this added participation from trainers and jockeys. So I would say, though, that when Natalie and I were talking, if and when Golden Gate Fields does close, that is going to be a 25% hit to our 20% hit to our revenue annually for our purses, our purse contributions. So it's significant. Yeah, it's definitely significant. We are dependent on the racing industry, like so many other organizations. The bulk of our funding comes from, and primarily the funding that we use for granting, right? So it's not just us, it's not just CARMA that is affected by the contraction. Frankly, we have other funding sources, and we do quite a bit of fundraising to cover all of the other programs and services that we provide. But our purse contributions, we've dedicated to our grants. And so that means that we have less money to give to grants to our charity partners, which to me is really the bigger impact, because they're the ones that have these horses 12 months out of the year, or are trying to do adoptions, or, are using them for their therapy programs and are relying on grant money to, fund a particular service or cover a particular expense. So,
oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Sorry. So it's real.
Something that probably impacts the degree to which, obviously impacts the degree to which there's demand on those finances, is the volume of horses that are needing placement. And as we discussed, there's not really this crazy big wave happening at this moment as a result of Golden Gate preparing to close possibly next year. But what are some things that kind of could be considered, I guess, risk factors for a horse who may make the horse more likely to need placement? We talk about risk factors in terms of injuries. What are some sort of risk factors to a horse as far as like it's time they might need help?
Yeah, I mean, you and I talked about this, and I don't see right now a dramatic increase in need for racing horses. My biggest concern in terms of the aftercare community is those horses that aren't at the racetrack, right? So what about the gonna be 2-year-olds next spring? If Golden Gate is really closing in June, are they going to spend the money to break and train those 2-year-olds to get them to the races for 2 or 3 months of racing? What about the yearlings, the weanlings that are on the ground now that are going to be yearlings next year that would be, pointed to that circuit? I feel like, horses that are at the farm or are on layup now and recovering from an injury that normally would come back into training in the early spring, late winter, are they going to come back? Like, to me, those are kind of bigger issues. And from CARMA's perspective, I get requests or inquiries about horses that don't, we serve, CARMA's programs are designed to serve horses that have raced at the track. So because our funding comes from, as we just talked about, purses, which comes from handle, which means that we want more horses racing. So we have larger handle. So we have more purses so that we can get more money to fund the horses when they're done, right? It's kind of this big loop that we rely on. And so we're not really in a position to support horses that haven't participated in that funding cycle. And that's my bigger concern. Like, I worry about all of the thoroughbreds that are kind of in the in-between, right? They're either on their way into racing or on a layup, and the timing is just going to end up being terrible, because who's going to want to bring a horse back when they don't know if they're going to have racing in 2 or 3 months? It's very uncertain. I think that's, to me, the biggest concern. And I don't know that it's a risk factor necessarily. I think obviously injured horses are always a risk factor. I think older horses are a risk factor. I think my opinion is that brood mares are particularly vulnerable because they have spent years I know that they're handled, but fairly isolated in a field. I mean, if you've ever been out in a field with a band of brood mares, they're somewhat feral. They're just, they're not easily handled, right? So those are horses, to me, that are at risk, that have a higher risk factor. Weanlings, yearlings, just turned 2-year-olds that haven't had a lot of track foundation. I mean, you both know race horses are really well broke. They can handle pretty much anything. There's so much going on in their daily life that we can take them to a riding stable, and the fact that there's kids running around, and that there's this and there's that, and there's a tractor going by, and there's, a golf cart and somebody on a scooter, or like whatever. We've seen all of that and more at the racetrack. Nothing surprises us. But those just turned 2-year-olds that have never been to the track, the yearlings, the brood mares that have been in a field for, several years, those are difficult horses to rehome. And we don't have a permanent retirement infrastructure that can absorb those kinds of horses, particularly in California. Especially in California.
Well, Lucinda, I can't even imagine what things would be like if CARMA hadn't started. What, it's been 15 years.
15 years. Yeah.
Madeline Arbach was a relentless advocate for it, and she
yes.
got a lot of credit. If you could make one change to the business, one new program to help with aftercare, what would that be?
Oh, hands down, more permanent retirement facilities. We need more farms that are willing to and financially able to provide permanent retirement for these horses. And that doesn't mean that they are useless, but horses that can't be ridden, that can't have or shouldn't have a riding career, we need places for those horses to go. I think by and large, that is our biggest need in aftercare, permanent sanctuary. It's expensive to feed a horse for 25 years.
It is.
Yeah. So I'm looking for a miracle farm.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time. We really appreciate what you do, what CARMA does for the industry. It's an issue that, as you said, used to be whispered among people. Now it's out in the open. I think there's been a lot of progress, but there's still a long way to go.
Yes, I agree.
All right. Lucinda Lovitt with the CARMA, California Retirement Management Account out in California. On behalf of myself, Natalie Voss, and Lucinda, thanks for joining us on the Friday show. Big day of racing Sunday at Woodbine, including the Canadian International. It's Secretariat's 50th anniversary winning the race. Big day. at Woodbine. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week on the Friday Show.
Support award-winning independent horse industry journalism and become a Paulick Report Insider on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, insiders get access to exclusive Q&As with Paulick Report staff, insight behind our editorial process, exclusive opinions and on-site analysis, Paulick Report merch, and more. This is not a paywall. The website you know and love will always be the same. But if you want more, and you want to make our coverage even better, visit patreon.com/Paulick Report and become a Paulick Report Insider today.